Hey Free Thought Flora, you'll have to forgive me for the quality of this video. It's literally my first I've ever made, but I thought for both of our sakes I'd condense this second novel of a comment so it's something you can listen to rather than be overwhelmed by. As a side note, in the future, if you're going to respond to me, it would be great to get a message saying so. I actually accidentally found your video was over my comment, and I wish I found it sooner, but I had no idea I was even mentioned, much less that I warranted a full half-an-hour video. Before I begin, I'd also like to say that much of what I'm about to say is not directed solely at you. This rationality rules issue has rubbed against schism I've seen in atheist circles for years, and I'm honestly tired of leaving it up to others to argue against a wave of people that often seem unaware of how they affect others with their platforms. This video also covers a ton of disparate topics, many of which are not even about Stephen, but rather inspired by the controversy itself. So, if you're interested, here's my response to your video. The transcript with the embedded links will be included in a Reddit comment on your video. First, I want to talk about your example of rolling over and hitting your wife to answer the question, is injuring someone that happens to be of a minority race racist? To answer your question, no, that is not the kind of argument being made here. The mere act of accidentally harming someone is not sufficient to be racist. Bigotry of any kind can be traced back to the assumptions held within the statement made or action taken. For example, saying, "Wow, you're intelligent for a woman," is a sexist statement because the underlying assumption of the statement is that women aren't intelligent. This is different from accidentally giving offense to a woman where no such underlying assumption exists. So your example of accidentally hitting your wife being racist doesn't at all address what I'm saying. Next, you say that you think you value intent and motivation more than I do. This is undoubtedly true. The difference I see between a vitriolic bigot and someone spreading misinformation and fear about a minority group out of ignorance is simply that the two are doing it for different reasons. The act itself is still condemnable, and I give the benefit of the doubt to the accidental bigot only temporarily so that they can show good faith and address their mistakes, and importantly, stop making those mistakes. Aside from that, the effects of both types of bigotry are the same, so I'll treat the ideas expressed similarly, even if I give lenience to the accidental bigot. After this, you make a point that is perhaps my strongest point of disagreement, that ignorantly advocating for racial discrimination isn't racism, it's just being wrong. Okay, so first, racism is often in no small part based in ignorance, so saying you're just wrong doesn't really get you out of accusations of racism or transphobia for that matter. Ignorance is often the foundation of bigotry. Second, racism is defined as prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed at someone of a different race based on the belief that one's own race is superior. So, sticking to our example, it should be obvious that arguing that a black person is intellectually inferior and thus shouldn't vote is by definition racist. If we can't agree that espousing the view that a race is less intelligent and therefore should be stripped of rights is racist, then we simply can go no further in this discussion. Whatever definition of racism that you seem to be operating under seems to me to be so completely exclusionary that no one but the most hateful, virulent racist could possibly qualify. Your definition would likely not include the horrors of Jim Crow as racist, as it could be argued that those that instituted it genuinely thought that black people were inferior and therefore shouldn't have the same rights as whites. Yours is a non-functional definition. Either you understand that racism, and transphobia as well, is a spectrum of severity in which the argument out of ignorance for the removal of a person's rights exists on that spectrum and is therefore racist or transphobic, or you're simply wrong. That's how I see it. Later, you claim that being wrong about something is human nature and we should assume ignorance before malice. I don't disagree, but when you make a video calling for action, you take on a burden of responsibility. Stephen colossally failed in that responsibility, and doing so required no malice on his part, just faulty assumptions, laziness, and ignorance. Whether someone had malicious intent only matters in whether we decide to patiently wait as that person takes time to adjust their views or not. Otherwise, it's irrelevant. You may be asking why people like me hold this belief. Why does intent not matter when espousing bigoted views? If you're interested in a more nuanced view of bigotry than I can give in a few sentences, check out T1J's video. Racist is an adjective, not a noun. Speaking generally for people on the left, we think like this because nearly no one, not even indisputable racists, actually identify as racists. Richard Spencer doesn't. Hell, George Wallace claimed that he was not a racist, and his campaign slogan was segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. So a person claiming they're not a bigot should mean literally nothing to those making the judgment. Observing behavior should be the determining factor. Their underlying assumptions and the end result of what they're advocating for should be what's examined. Stephen's assumptions were faulty, his rhetoric painted trans people as a threat, and the end result of his argument was a call for blatant discrimination. This is transphobic rhetoric, and I see no way to deny it. As your video continues, you bring up something that I see people claim about this fiasco all the time, that Woodford should have not been turned into a monster in the eyes of the public. But Woodford wasn't. He was called out for transphobic views, which he did express. The ACA only said that they would be, quote, asking him to refrain from appearances until he released a clarifying statement on his channel. This wasn't making him into a monster. It was holding him to account for what he said and the effects it has, and implied he could reappear on the show after making a statement. Even his most outspoken critic, Essence of Thought, rebutted his points at length in their first video and didn't insist Stephen was malicious. These reactions are hardly grabbing a torch and pitchfork. They're entirely appropriate for a prominent atheist figure espousing transphobic views. You continue this line of thought talking about how if your crime was ignorance, we should treat you accordingly. I want to correct this. Stephen did far, far more than just be ignorant. It's one thing to be ignorant. It's another thing entirely to make a call to discriminate based on that ignorance. It's yet another thing to repeatedly double down on it, as he since has. Now, in keeping with your discussion of ignorance, you compare Woodford's ignorance to a 9-year-old picking a mushroom. I don't think this is a good comparison. A more apt comparison is that an adult takes it upon themselves to research for others what mushrooms are good to eat and which aren't. They claim to have done research, and their entire professional persona is centered on, quote, rationality. When it comes time to share their findings with their audience, their views are not at all well researched, as they didn't consult with a single mycologist on the issue, nor did they research much beyond anecdotes and the views of uneducated pundits. What responsibility does this person have for those that become sickened when following the recommendations? None? I can't agree if you say they have none, or even the amount of responsibility an ignorant child would bear. Adults should know better than a child. Next, we get to a part of your video that was actually very aggravating. Your point about making claims about minority groups by comparing those groups to the situation of denying pedophiles the right to work around children. This is enormously dishonest in multiple ways. Even ignoring how you purposefully skipped over the notion of making false claims, your argument is incredibly unfair. First, the typical usage of, quote, minority group is in regards to sex, religion, gender, disability, race, or ethnicity. Additionally, the act of pedophilia is morally abhorrent and is in no way comparable to being an ethnic, sexual, or gender minority. So not only did you equivocate the phrase minority group to mean literally any group that is not in the majority, you specifically chose a group whose acts are morally repugnant in a way that trans people are not to make your point. So I don't think this is an all-appropriate response to my point. Moving on, at one point you ask, who decides what is misinformation? That's an excellent question. However, I think in this case it should be obvious. Of the science Stephen did quote in some of his videos, he didn't even read the papers properly. He also used anecdotes that, if examined in the slightest bit critically, as Essence of Thought did, fall apart and don't support his argument. At every turn, Stephen showed he was either extraordinarily lazy or careless when talking about this issue, so we don't even have to address who decides what misinformation is, because the lack of quality of Stephen's research should speak for itself. And now we get to the inevitable conservative point, and one that I find a bit exhausting to have to rebut, the open marketplace of ideas defense. Personally, I don't think the libertarian model of an open marketplace of ideas actually works in reality, as certain speech tends to overwhelm other forms of speech. People with a larger microphone can easily make those with smaller ones afraid by spreading discriminatory ideas, or we can end up in a situation where bad ideas are treated as equivalent to good ones. Think about the news having climate change deniers on TV alongside a single scientist to give, quote, both sides. Every market needs some form of regulation. You're welcome to ask questions about who should have the kind of authority to do the regulating, and in doing so you join a proud left-wing tradition, but the notion of a market with no regulation except for those who have the money and power to sway it is far more frightening a concept than one that has some sort of overt rules of moderation. To continue on to your next point, after I mentioned Woodford's use of Joe Rogan clips, you said you don't see a problem with using Joe Rogan as a source. My issue is that Joe Rogan is not only not an expert in trans issues, he is actively denigrating to trans people. Woodford himself acknowledges this in his apology video, as well as acknowledging that his reiteration of those views is something of a tacit agreement with them. As for your claim that sampling Joe Rogan can demonstrate public opinion, that's actually not what the clip was even used for. Stephen used it to reinforce his points and gave Joe Rogan a platform at the end of his video to end it. Now, I'd like to move on and address what you said about how Stephen shouldn't be required to consult trans people. I actually think consulting trans people for every video about trans issues is not an absolute necessity. It's just an example of the inexcusably poor research that Stephen did, that he didn't even do the bare minimum, which is simply asking a trans person their input. He could have gone even further than that and consulted experts that would have had a better grasp of it than he did, which I doubt you would disagree with. Facts are facts, but the interpretation of those facts can be colored by your perception, including the views of others that are more intimately associated with or knowledgeable of the topic would be a boon, as was well within Stephen's ability to ask. Additionally, I think consulting with trans people should be done if you're going to not just talk about issues pertaining to them, but also suggest a course of action. It seems to be a minimum courtesy if you're going to be spouting off about how we shouldn't allow them to compete with cis women to include them. I mean, imagine how you feel as an atheist, hearing Christians that have power over your life talk about you, but never to you, about how you should be dealt with. If that sends a shiver down your spine, congratulations, you're seeing this as I do. Later in your video you ask, what kind of apology would be good enough? This is an interesting question, and one I hear from right-wing people all the time, as if the left is some ravenous beast that never accepts an apology and is always searching for weakness. The truth is, though, that the reason apologies sometimes don't go over well is because they're given in a way that makes them seem insincere or like the person doesn't actually understand why what they did was hurtful. One way to do it would be an admission that he was not only mistaken on matters of fact, but that he held transphobic views, rather than claim victimhood at people saying he was a transphobe, which the ACA and his outspoken critics didn't actually say. Most of Woodford's apology was him lamenting being excluded and how he was maligned, which he wasn't. He was being addressed based on the views he expressed. The ACA didn't call him a transphobe, just that he had expressed transphobic views, making an apology video largely about yourself when it should be about the people affected by your actions seems insincere at best. Another big part of any apology is to stop doing the thing you have to apologize for, which Woodford hasn't. He continually doubled down after his first video, spreading the same views with new, quote, evidence. This doesn't show remorse. It shows that he was sorry he got called on it and thought he could express the same views in a different way. You cite your experience teaching kids to explain how you think we should handle this kind of thing, but Stephen is not a kid, is he? He's an adult, and fully capable of responding to criticism with the maturity a child is not. Part of adulthood should be to learn how to unequivocally say, I'm sorry and won't do it again, without making the apology about you and how you're a victim. Now, on to something that truly bothered me in your video. When you asked, when other atheists are being reasonable and logical, that makes you think they're conservative? Especially because you were laughing about it, and it was a complete misinterpretation of what I said. The answer is no, and frankly the misinterpretation here is the most aggravating of all the misinterpretations you've had so far, and this isn't your first or even your second. What I mean by this is that conservative atheists claim for themselves the label of being reasonable, implying that others are not. They claim they're being rational and free thinkers, when the reality is often they don't even use their ability to freely think beyond their own ignorant intuitions. The issue I have is that conservative atheists never seem to want to admit being conservatives. They dishonestly pretend like they don't have a political bent, preferring to label themselves with the trappings of intelligentsia, and that their views are just the skeptical or rational ones, not views that are the product of a political worldview. It's the lie I have an issue with, not the politics. I can argue with the politics. The lie is something that conservative atheists tell themselves and each other, reinforcing a sense of superiority over anyone that would challenge those ideas, and it's not something I can argue with. It's baked into the worldview, a fundamental assumption that whatever comes out of the conservative atheist's mouth is by default rational because they have identified themselves as rational. This leads me into my next point to address your question. What does your politics matter? It matters because you, like others, seem to make claims to objectivity, reasonableness, etc., yet I find that multiple times you manipulated my argument or otherwise abused metaphors to your advantage, and seem to have a reflexive defense of viewpoints that prop up, in my view, an ignorant understanding of current political topics. I don't begrudge conservatives their opinions, though I will disagree strongly. I do begrudge stealthily inserting conservative rhetoric into a discussion as if it's just reason or logic, especially when it's so often not. It's a dishonest rebranding of opinions designed to set the conservative up as speaking some common sense by default, and I find it grating. Everyone that argues in good faith is interested in being rational, yet there's always a group of atheists that will a priori label their arguments the rational and reasonable ones so as to make the opposition seem less so. I can argue against conservative opinions, and I have. I'm not dismissing your views simply because you're conservative. I'm not saying because your views are conservative, they're wrong. I'm saying I think your conservative views are wrong, and you're sneaking them in under the radar as being politically neutral, while simultaneously and subtly denigrating those that disagree. Most of this response has me being fully capable of arguing against your views without bringing up conservatism. The only reason I did in my previous comment was because I'm accusing you and others of being evasive of your conservatism, while trying to take a sort of intellectual high ground for yourself by calling yourself a free thinker or skeptic. You say that conservative atheists hold back their views from other atheists, perhaps out of fear of social repercussions for espousing them. Now, for some background, I'm an atheist who grew up in rural Texas. My high school was literally adjacent to a longhorn cattle ranch. Prayers were held at my school, and my senior year science teacher was an outspoken creationist. Being homophobic was the norm there. I am aware of the social consequences of being an outsider. However, conservative atheists aren't just hiding their views. There's a difference between being covert with your views to prevent being ostracized and cloaking them as something other than what they are, especially when that cloak is an attempt to establish that you're the rational one right out of the gate. The former is understandable. The latter is underhanded. I also don't think that conservative views, especially on the topic of trans issues, are as rare as you make out. The views Stephen espoused are not outside the mainstream of atheist culture, as evidenced by his support and viewer-based response. So when it comes to conservative atheists holding back their views, I don't entirely buy it's because they're scared of being ostracized by other atheists. I think it's a tactic to try and shift the Overton window to the right, because if conservative views suddenly just become rational, then everything to the left of that must not be rational, which is exactly how much of online culture treats social issues. Prominent atheist figures go on long rants about feminists, SJWs, and the like, strawmanning those positions as hysterical, while they're by contrast so reasonable. So sorry, but I don't really buy it being a defense mechanism, especially given how many people seem to vocally agree with you, yet dogpile people like Essence of Thought, who has multiple times produced 45-minute long cited videos debunking Woodford for not reading a damn paper correctly. These reactions make it patently obvious these conflicts are always conservative outrage to political politics, not facts, reasons, or evidence. I want to end this point with something for you to think about. You say you're accustomed to social exclusion and how painful it is because you were an atheist growing up in a religious area. Now I want you to imagine how you'd feel being trans. Think about everything you just described to me. Now think about being such a minority that even atheists, a generally reviled group, get to discuss whether you should have rights, and have that conversation being taken seriously within their community. Imagine being in a situation where the president can announce your exclusion from military service via tweet or strip you of protections against discrimination. Imagine the President of the United States joking about his vice president wanting to hang you. Let me not mince words here, Nick. You and I both sound like we grew up in places that didn't tolerate dissent. Yet you and I know nothing about the plight of people who are trans, who have high suicide rates because of how society treats them, who are outsiders in nearly every community they participate in and often can't hide. And views like the one that Stephen espoused, the ignorant conservative ones, are so often the ones that contribute to the stripping of rights and privileges from them. That feeling that you have, where you feel nervous to espouse your views to atheists in general, imagine being trans and being part of this community. This place where no one has a religious reason to hate you, and perhaps the one place you think you won't be disowned, only to hear Stephen spreading misinformation and making calls to exclude you, and it's received with a warm response. Being critical of conservative viewpoints is not the same as being critical of the place of trans people in society. Conservative views are ideas, and often are ideas that center on the enforcement of the status quo at the expense of the quality of life of others. If you don't like how you feel like you have to hide because your opinions won't be well met, imagine feeling like you had to hide because who you are won't be well met in one of the only communities that has no reason to exclude you. And understand that opinions like Stephen Woodford did nothing wrong contributes exactly to that environment. This is why I'm combative against conservative views. because a conservative perspective is often the worldview insisting that injustice is justifiable. This probably came off hostile, but I think I'll steal your Black Panther quote and say, I don't care. I can discuss things in a civil manner, but I refuse to treat ideas that strip rights from others based on misinformation and laziness as justified or as anything other than the bigotry it is. In your video, you say that I must be just attributing right-wing slant to everyone I hear speaking rationally, and here you prove my previous point about claiming conservatism as being the reasonable thing by default. You're taking an a priori position of being rational. I'm saying that I disagree with your reasoning, that it's incorrect. I'm saying that what I'm hearing is not skeptical or reasonable. I'm saying that those that claim the title of reasonable for themselves often do so to grant themselves legitimacy without actually desiring to generally explore all perspectives of an issue. This video was probably rather heavy in terms of a response. I want you to know that I don't hold ill will. I truly believe that we as a community have a responsibility to self-police and to ensure that people who have a large audience don't use it to mislead and make the lives of minorities harder. We are one of the few communities that can be a safe haven for the LGBT community, but when I see speech like Stephen's used in a way that would make many trans people feel like their place in society isn't supported by us, I have no patience for it. I'm sure that came across, and I feel no need to apologize for it. I think it was wrong of a prominent YouTuber to use his platform to irresponsibly and lazily cover a controversial topic where his popular opinion will affect real lives. Maybe this dialogue will be fruitful and continue. If that's not of interest, I understand, and I hope I'll give you something worth thinking about. If not, I tried, and that's really all I can do.